There is a silence that falls over the northern forests in the deepest part of winter, a silence so profound it feels like a weight upon the chest. It is a world where the sky turns the color of iron and the earth becomes as hard as stone, blurring the line between the living and the dead. In this ancient landscape, where the rivers freeze into highways of ice and the mist clings to the pine needles like a second skin, history is often written in smoke and ash. But before the fire, there was the water. Before the saint, there was the ferryman's daughter. And before the name Olga echoed through the stone halls of Kiev, there was only the quiet splash of oars cutting through the currents of the Velikaya River. The story begins in the grey light of the north, near the settlement of Pskov. The year is buried under centuries of snowfall. Somewhere near the turn of the 10th century, the air here smells of damp earth and pine resin. A young woman stands on a wooden barge, her hands roughened by the cold and the wood of the oars. Her name is Helga, a name carried from the fjords of Scandinavia, sharp and clear like a winter wind. To the Slavic tribes who inhabit the riverbanks, she will become Olga, a softening of the sound, blending the Norse heritage with the dark soil of the Russes. Legends are often born from chance encounters, and hers is no different. It is said that Prince Igor, the son of Rurik, the founder of the dynasty that would rule these lands for centuries, was hunting in the forests nearby. He needed to cross the river. He saw a figure in a boat and hailed the ferryman, only to discover, as the hood was pulled back, a young woman of striking, formidable beauty. Igor, accustomed to taking what he desired, made an advance. But Helga was not merely a peasant to be used. She spoke with a wisdom and a fierce dignity that halted the prince, shaming him for his lack of honor. She reminded him that a ruler must be the master of his own impulses before he can master a people. In that moment, on the rocking wood of the ferry in the middle of the cold river, a bond was forged, not of romance, but of respect. When they married, bringing her to the wooden fortress of Kiev, she was likely no older than 15. She entered a world dominated by the sword and the axe. The Varangian ruling class, the Vikings of the East, were warriors and traders who moved like wolves through the river systems, extracting tribute from the local Slavic tribes. It was a brutal ecosystem of power. Igor was a man of this world, ambitious, greedy, and often reckless. Olga, however, possessed a mind like a chessboard. She watched. She learned the currents of politics just as she had learned the currents of the river. For years she lived in the shadow of her husband, bearing him a son, Sviatoslav. But the threads of fate were being spun in the forests of the Drevlians, a neighboring tribe who resented the heavy hand of Kiev. In the autumn of 945, the hunger of the prince would alter the course of history. Igor had gone to collect the annual tribute, the Polyody. He took furs, honey, and wax, stripping the Drevlians of their wealth. Yet, as he turned his horses back toward Kiev, a dark thought took hold of him. He decided the tribute was not enough. Sending the bulk of his army home, he returned with a small retinue to demand more. The Drevlians, seeing the prince return with so few men, spoke a proverb that would become his epitaph. If a wolf comes back to the sheep, he will carry away the whole flock one by one. Unless he is killed, they did not pay. Instead, they swarmed out of their fortified city of Iskorostan. They captured the prince and his men. The execution they devised was a testament to the savagery of the age. They found 2 young, flexible birch trees and bent them down until they touched the ground. They tied Igor's legs to the trees, one to each. Then they cut the ropes holding the trees down. The birches snapped back upright with terrifying force, tearing the prince in half. The news of Igor's death travelled to Kiev with the speed of a winter storm. Olga was now a widow. Her son Sviatoslav was only 3 years old, too young to hold a sword, let alone a kingdom. The realm stood on a precipice. In the eyes of the Drevlians, and perhaps even her own retainers, a woman alone was an opportunity. The Drevlians, emboldened by their victory, sent a delegation of 20 ambassadors to Kiev. Their message was an insult wrapped in a proposal, Olga should marry their Prince Mal, the very man who had orchestrated her husband's murder, thereby merging the two lands under Drevlian rule. It was here, in the depths of her grief, that the ferry girl vanished and the Iron Regent was born. She understood that in this world, mercy was a death sentence. If she showed a flicker of weakness, her son would be killed, and Kiev would burn. She had to become something more terrifying than a warrior. She had to become a force of nature. When the 20 Drevlian ambassadors arrived by boat, dressed in their finest robes, expecting a cowed and frightened widow, Olga received them with a calm, unnatural grace. She told them she would honor them, but they must be carried in their boat to her palace the next day, as if they were too noble to walk on the ground. The ambassadors, blinded by their own arrogance, agreed. The next morning they sat in their boat as Olga's soldiers lifted it onto their shoulders. But they were not carried to the hall. They were carried to a great trench that had been dug in the courtyard during the night. The soldiers threw the boat, with the men still inside, into the pit. As the ambassadors screamed, realizing their fate, Olga peered over the edge. She asked them quietly if they found the honor to their liking. Then she ordered the earth to be shoveled in. They were buried alive, their screams silenced by the heavy, cold soil of Kiev. But the earth was only the first element she would wield. She sent a message back to the Drevlians, feigning acceptance of the marriage proposal, but claiming that the first group of ambassadors was not enough. She requested their best men, the governors, the nobles, the merchants, to escort her to their prince. The Drevlians, unaware of the fate of the first group, sent their finest leaders. When they arrived, dusty from the road, Olga invited them to wash in the bathhouse before the feast. They entered the wooden structure, stripping off their clothes, relaxing in the steam. Then the doors were barred from the outside. Torches were touched to the dry timber. The bathhouse became an inferno. The fire consumed the Drevlian elite, turning their political power to ash, earth and fire. Now she required blood. With the Drevlian leadership decapitated, Olga travelled to their capital Iskorostan, the place of her husband's death. She sent word ahead that she wished only to weep over Igor's grave and hold a trizna, a traditional funeral feast, before surrendering to Prince Mal. The common people of the Drevlians, leaderless and confused, allowed her entry. She ordered her men to pile up mounds of earth and to pour rivers of mead. The Drevlian soldiers were invited to drink in honor of the fallen prince. Olga moved among them, a pale, ghostly figure in the firelight, waiting. When 5,000 Drevlians were drunk, incapacitated by the mead and the false promise of peace, she gave the signal. Her small retinue drew their swords. The feast turned into a slaughter. The night air was filled with the metallic scent of blood, a ritualistic purging that left the grass slick and red. Yet Iskorostan still stood. The city itself, behind its high wooden walls, refused to surrender. Olga laid siege to it for a year. The defenders fought with the desperation of the doomed, knowing what she had done to their leaders. But a siege is a slow, grinding thing, and Olga possessed a patience that was terrifying. As the seasons turned, she offered them terms. She told them she had had her revenge, and wished only for a small tribute to lift the siege and return home. She asked not for furs or silver, but for something simple, something that seemed harmless. 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house. The relief inside the city was palpable. The Drevlians caught the birds and sent them out to her camp, believing the nightmare was over. But as the sun began to set, turning the sky a bruised purple, Olga gave her command. Her soldiers took pieces of cloth soaked in sulphur, wrapped them around small embers, and tied them to the legs of the birds. At a signal, the birds were released. Driven by instinct, the pigeons and sparrows flew back to their nests, under the eaves of the wooden houses, into the thatch of the barns, into the haylofts of Iskorostan. Within moments the city did not just catch fire, it erupted. Thousands of small fires began simultaneously in the rooftops. There was no water enough to fight it, no way to stop the sky from raining flame. The people fled the burning city, running into the arms of Olga's waiting soldiers. Those who were not killed were taken as slaves. The city of Iskorostan was erased, a black scar on the land, a testament to the price of waking the anger of the regent. With the Drevlians broken, one might expect Olga to continue a reign of terror. But the smoke cleared and a transformation occurred. The destroyer became the architect. Olga understood that the chaotic, predatory system of tax collection that had killed her husband was unsustainable. She did not want to burn her kingdom, she wanted to build it. She travelled through the lands, not with a torch, but with a measuring rod. She established oroki, fixed amounts of tribute that were known and agreed upon, ending the arbitrary greed of the princes. She created pogosti, trading posts, and administrative centres where the tribute could be brought safely. She was carving the first true structures of a state out of the wilderness. She marked hunting grounds and borders, imposing order on the wild mosaic of tribes. Her gaze then turned south, toward the golden city of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. In the mid-950s, Olga undertook a journey that was as much a diplomatic conquest as a spiritual one. She sailed down the Dnieper, across the turbulent Black Sea, arriving at the gates of the greatest city in the world. To the Russians, used to timber forts and mud streets, Constantinople was a hallucination of marble, gold, and silk. She entered the court of Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, not as a barbarian supplicant, but as an equal. The chronicles tell of a battle of wits. The emperor, captivated by her intelligence and her formidable presence, is said to have proposed marriage to her. It was a political maneuver to bring the Rus under his direct control. Olga, however, was already playing a deeper game. She told him she could not marry him as she was a pagan. She asked to be baptized, and she insisted that the emperor himself be her godfather. The ceremony was performed in the radiant Hagia Sophia under the soaring dome that seemed to hold the heavens themselves. She stood in the water, renouncing the old gods of thunder and oak, and took the Christian name Helen. When the emperor renewed his proposal, now that she was a Christian, Olga smiled the smile that had once silenced the Drevlians. She reminded him of the laws of the church. A godfather cannot marry his goddaughter. It would be spiritual incest. The emperor, realizing he had been outmaneuvered by the barbarian queen, could only laugh and admit her cleverness. She left Constantinople with gifts of gold, silver, and precious fabrics. But more importantly, she left with her independence intact and a new spiritual authority. Yet Olga's vision was not limited to the south. She played the board of Europe with a sophistication that baffled her contemporaries. When Byzantium was slow to grant the church hierarchy she desired, she sent envoys west to the court of Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor. She requested a bishop and priests from the Latin Rite. It was a calculated threat to the Byzantines, a signal that Kiev could turn west just as easily as it turned south. Though the mission of the Western Bishop Adalbert ultimately failed due to the hostility of the pagans in Kiev, the move showed Olga's grasp of the wider geopolitical landscape. She was weaving Kiev into the fabric of the known world. Despite her baptism, the conversion of her land would not happen in her lifetime. Her son, Sviatoslav, had grown into a warrior of the old mold. He lived in the saddle, slept on the rough ground with a saddle for a pillow, and ate horse flesh roasted over open fires. When Olga urged him to accept the Christian God, he laughed. He feared his druzina, his warband, would mock him. He belonged to the gods of war, Perun and Veles. Olga did not force him. She loved her son, even as he drifted further into the violent ethos she had tried to tame. She spent her later years in Kiev, raising her grandsons among them, a boy named Vladimir, while Sviatoslav campaigned in distant lands. The final test of her resolve came in 968. Sviatoslav was away, fighting the Bulgarians on the Danube, dreaming of moving his capital south. Kiev was left vulnerable. The Pechenegs, nomadic raiders from the steppe, who moved like a locust swarm, surrounded the city. Olga, now an elderly woman, once again stood on the walls. She was trapped with her 3 grandsons. The water was running low. The food was scarce. The Pechenegs were so close they could shout insults at the defenders. Yet she held the city together through sheer force of will until a ruse allowed a messenger to escape and recall the Rus' armies. When Sviatoslav finally returned and drove the raiders away, he found his mother frail in body but unbroken in spirit. Death approached her not as a violent stranger, but as a quiet guest. In 969, the woman who had buried men alive and burned cities to the ground made her final revolutionary act. She forbade the trizna. There would be no feasting, no drinking, no ritual slaughter of horses or slaves over her grave. She requested a Christian burial with a priest to sing the prayers over her body. It was a rejection of the Viking way of death, a final severance from the cycle of violence she had once mastered. When she died, the chronicles say her son and her grandsons wept for her, and the people carried her with great sorrow. They buried her in the earth she had ruled, but this time the earth did not swallow a victim, it embraced a saint. The mist of the Velikaya River seemed to settle over her tomb, and the iron sky of the north watched in silence. She had been a ferry girl, a princess, a widow, an avenger, a reformer, and a diplomat. She had walked through the fire and emerged carrying a cross. But as the dirt fell upon her coffin, the seeds she had planted, the seeds of statehood, of law, and of a new faith, were only just beginning to germinate in the cold, dark soil. The winter was ending, the era of the chaotic warlords was fading, and something new was rising in the east. The grandmother had gone to her rest, but the grandson, young Vladimir, had watched her closely. He had seen the power of her god and the strength of her will, and though he did not know it yet, the torch she had carried was now waiting for his hand to lift it. The wind shifts over the steppe, blowing from the south, carrying the scent of incense and the distant echo of church bells that have not yet been cast. The story of the north continues, flowing like the great river, relentless and deep. The mists of history part slowly, revealing the deep, ancient woods of the 10th century, a time when the land was vast, wild, and ruled by the law of the strong. The rivers were the veins of the world, carrying traders, warriors, and kings through the dark heart of the forest. But away from the river banks, the trees held secrets that no axe had ever touched. It was here, in the dense, brooding territories of the Drevlians, that the fate of a dynasty would be decided, not by the clash of great armies, but by the snapping of wood and the silence of the winter wind. The Grand Prince Igor, son of Rurik, was a man of the sword and the coin. He was the ruler of Kievan Rus, a sprawling, loosely knit tapestry of tribes and tribute payers. Every winter, as the rivers froze into highways of ice, the prince and his retinue, the Druzina, would ride out from the high hills of Kiev. They called it Polyudi, the going round. It was a harvest not of wheat, but of furs, honey, wax, and silver, gathered from the Slavic tribes who bowed to the Varangian masters. The winter of 945 was particularly harsh. The frost was a living thing that bit through fur and leather, and the snow lay heavy on the branches of the pines, bending them low toward the earth. Igor had completed his rounds among the Drevlians, a tribe of forest dwellers who lived in the fortified town of Iskorostan. They were a proud people, rooted in the earth like the oaks that surrounded their homes, wary of the outsiders who came only to take. They had paid their tribute. They had given the furs of the marten and the fox. They had given the honey that would sweeten the wine of the Kievan court. They watched with stone-faced relief as the prince's sleds turned back toward the south, their heavy runners carving deep grooves in the packed snow. But greed is a whisper that grows into a roar. A few miles from Iskorostan, the prince halted. His warriors, men with braided beards and eyes the color of cold iron, murmured among themselves. They looked at their own cloaks, worn thin by the wind, and compared them to the imagined wealth that remained hidden in the Drevlian storehouses. They spoke of the other retinues, of the wealth of other lords, and their pride began to sting. Igor, listening to the counsel of envy, made a decision that would alter the course of history. He told the main body of his army to continue home to Kiev with the wagons of tribute. But he, with only a small company of his most trusted men, would turn back. He would squeeze the sponge once more. He would demand a second tribute, a tax upon the tax. It was a violation of the unwritten law of the forest. When the Drevlians heard that the prince was returning, not with an army, but with a handful of men, their fear turned into a cold, hard rage. Their leader, Prince Mao, gathered his elders in the smoke-filled long hall of Iskorostom. The firelight danced on their weathered faces as they spoke the words that would become a proverb for the ages. "If a wolf enters the flock," Mao said, his voice low and steady, "he will carry off every sheep, one by one, until he is killed. If we do not kill him now, he will destroy us all." The forest closed in around Igor. He did not see the eyes watching from the thickets. He did not hear the soft crunch of boots on snow that was not the rhythm of his own men. When he approached the gates of Iskoroston, expecting fear and submission, he found only silence, and then the silence broke. The Drevlians swarmed from the trees like shadows detaching themselves from the bark. It was not a battle, it was an engulfment. The small retinue of the prince was overwhelmed in moments, their swords barely clearing their scabbards before they were dragged from their horses. There was no glory in the snow that day, only the brutal efficiency of a people defending their survival. They captured Igor alive. For the wolf who had returned to the flock, there would be no swift execution, no honourable death by the blade. The Drevlians marched him into the deep woods, to a place where two great birch trees grew close together, their white trunks stark against the grey sky. These were flexible giants, saplings that had grown into sinewy towers. The Drevlian men, strong from years of felling timber, climbed the trees. Using ropes of hemp and leather, they bent the tops of the birches down until they touched the frozen earth, the wood groaning and creaking under the immense tension. They tied the prince's legs to the bent tree's one leg to the left birch, one leg to the right. Igor, suspended for a moment in the terrifying geometry of their revenge, looked up at the canopy of the forest he had sought to exploit. The ropes were cut. With a sound like a thunderclap, the birch trees snapped back to their upright positions. The violence of the release was absolute. The trees returned to the sky, and the prince was torn asunder, his body broken by the very land he claimed to rule. The Drevlians left him there, a grim offering to the forest spirits, a warning written in blood and bone. The wolf was dead, the flock was safe, or so they believed. News travels slowly in the deep winter, but it travels with the inevitability of the setting sun. In Kiev, the Princess Olga waited. She was not a Slav by blood. She was Varangian, born of the Norse lineage that had swept down the river roads a century before. Her name was Helga, the Holy One, the Blessed One. She was young, perhaps only 20, and she held in her arms the 3-year-old heir Sviatoslav. When the survivor of the massacre stumbled into the courtyard of Kiev, frostbitten and trembling, and whispered the tale of the birch trees, a terrible silence descended upon the fortress. The boyar nobles looked at one another with unease. A dead prince meant chaos, a child heir meant weakness, and a widow. A widow was usually a pawn to be married off or cast aside, but they did not know Helga. They saw her grief, yes. She wept, for the bond of marriage was sacred, and Igor had been her protector. But beneath the tears, something ancient and metallic began to harden. In the philosophy of the North, grief is not merely sorrow, it is a debt. And debts must be paid. The Drevlians had not just killed a husband, they had insulted the blood of Rurik. They had shattered the order of the state. If she showed weakness now, if she faltered, if she negotiated, if she trembled, the surrounding tribes would smell blood. Kievan Rus would fracture into 100 warring fiefdoms, and her son would be lucky to survive as a beggar. Olga dried her tears. She sat upon the wooden throne of Kiev, her face a mask of pale porcelain, her eyes like the frozen Dnieper. She did not scream. She did not rage. She waited. The Drevlians, emboldened by their victory, made a fatal miscalculation. They believed that by killing the wolf, they had inherited his territory. They believed that Olga was merely a woman, a creature of soft emotions who would need a strong hand to guide her. Prince Mal, the architect of the ambush, conceived a plan that was as audacious as it was insulting. He would marry the widow by taking Olga as his wife. He would unite the Drevlian lands with Kiev, and he, the forest prince, would sit on the throne of the Russes. So, the Drevlians sent a delegation. They chose 20 of their finest men governors, elders, wealthy merchants, men of status and pride. They dressed them in their finest furs, combed their beards, and sent them down the river in long boats to Kiev. They came not as conquerors, but as suitors, bearing the offer of marriage like a poisoned chalice. When the boats arrived at the steep banks of the Dnieper below Kiev, the 20 ambassadors disembarked with their heads held high. They were led up the winding path to the fortress, expecting a nervous, grieving widow who would be grateful for their protection. Olga received them in the great hall. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her lap, the small form of Sviatobla playing near her feet. The hall was dim, lit by the flickering torchlight that cast long, dancing shadows against the log walls. The air smelled of wood smoke and tension. The Drevlian spokesman stepped forward. He was a large man, arrogant in his confidence. "Great princess," he boomed, "we have killed your husband, for he was like a wolf, plundering and destroying. But our Drevlian princes are good men who preserve the land. Marry our Prince Mal, and your son will be safe, and our lands will be won." Olga looked at them. She studied their faces, their confident stances, the way they looked around her hall, as if they already owned it. A faint, inscrutable smile touched her lips. It was the smile of a predator watching prey walk into a trap. "Your proposal is pleasing to me," Olga said, her voice soft, melodic, and terrifyingly calm. "Indeed, my husband is dead, and I cannot bring him back. I wish to honor you tomorrow in the presence of my people. For now, return to your boats. Go down to the river and rest. Tomorrow I will send for you, and when my messengers come, you must say to them, 'We will not ride on horses, nor walk on foot. Carry us in our boats. And my people will carry you in your boats, lifting you up in glory.' As is befitting men of your rank, the ambassadors were delighted. To be carried in their boats, this was a high honor, a gesture of supreme respect, implying that their feet were too noble to touch the mud of Kiev. They bowed low, blinded by their own vanity, and returned to the river bank, congratulating themselves on their diplomacy. They slept soundly that night, dreaming of the power they would wield when their prince sat on the throne. But up in the fortress there was no sleep. Under the cover of darkness, Olga gave a quiet command. In the center of the courtyard, near the stone tower of the palace, she ordered her soldiers to dig. They worked silently, spades biting into the earth, throwing up mounds of dark, cold soil. They dug a trench long, wide, and deep. It was not a foundation for a building. It was a wound in the earth. The sun rose, pale and watery, over the city of Kiev. The morning air was crisp. Olga dressed herself in her finest robes, the heavy embroidery shimmering in the light. She sent her messengers down to the river. The Drevlians were waiting. When the Kievans arrived, the ambassadors repeated the words Olga had put in their mouths, puffed up with pride. "We will not ride on horses, nor walk on foot. Carry us in our boats." The Kievans nodded, their faces grim and unreadable. "We are slaves to the helpless," they replied, a double-edged phrase the Drevlians did not catch. "Our prince is dead, and our princess is willing." They lifted the heavy wooden boats onto their shoulders, with the 20 ambassadors sitting inside them. It was a bizarre, surreal procession. The Drevlians sat in their fine furs, reclining against the wooden ribs of their vessels, waving to the crowds that gathered to watch. They were being carried up the hill, floating on a sea of shoulders, ascending toward the fortress like gods. They did not notice the silence of the crowd. They did not notice the absence of music. They were carried through the great gates of the citadel. The bearers marched directly toward the center of the courtyard, where the fresh earth lay piled high. The ambassadors smiled, expecting to be set down before a feast table. Instead, the bearers marched to the edge of the great trench and, in one fluid motion, heaved the boats forward. The vessels crashed down into the pit. The wood splintered. The men tumbled over one another, their dignity shattered in an instant, lying in a heap at the bottom of the deep, dark hole. Panic seized them. They looked up, and the rim of the trench was lined with the faces of the Kievan soldiers. And there, standing above them all, was Olga. She looked down into the pit, her face framed by the grey sky. She was no longer the grieving widow. She was the hand of judgment. She leaned over the edge, her voice carrying down to the terrified men who were now scrabbling at the steep earthen walls, trying to climb out. "Is the honor to your taste?" she asked quietly. Before they could answer, before they could beg or bargain, she raised her hand. The soldiers began to shovel the earth back into the trench. The first spadefuls of dirt hit the ambassadors with a soft thud. Realization dawned on them, a horror beyond words. This was not a negotiation. This was a burial. They screamed, they pleaded, they offered gold, land, power. They invoked the laws of hospitality, but the dirt kept falling. It rained down, covering their boots, their fine furs, their terrified faces. The sound of the shovels was rhythmic, hypnotic. Scrape, thud. Scrape, thud. The screams from the pit became muffled, turning into dull cries and then, slowly, fading into silence. The boats were buried. The men were buried. The pride of the Drevlians was swallowed by the earth of Kiev. Olga stood there until the trench was filled, until the ground was level once more. She did not look away. She watched every shovel of dirt. In the Viking tradition, a grave mound is a place of transition. But this was no mound of honor. It was an erasure. She had taken the men who thought to replace her husband and planted them like seeds of vengeance in her garden. But as the last of the dirt was patted down, Olga knew that this was only the beginning. The death of 20 men would not pay for the blood of a Rurikid prince. The Drevlians back in Iskorostan did not yet know that their ambassadors were dead. They were still waiting for news of the wedding. Olga turned from the fresh grave and looked toward the west, toward the land of the forests. Her face was calm, terrifyingly serene. She had broken the first wave. Now she would summon the second. She would not simply defeat her enemies, she would outwit them, dismantling their society piece by piece with a cold intellectual fury that was unlike anything these lands had ever seen. She called for her scribe. She had a message to send to Prince Mal. "Your ambassadors were worthy," she would write, the lie flowing from her as easily as breath. "But for me to come to you, I require more. Send me your noblest men, the governors and the chiefs, so that I may leave Kiev with great honor. Only then will I come to be your wife." She sealed the message. The game had begun. The birch tree had snapped. But the axe was now in the hands of the widow, and she would not stop swinging until the forest itself was leveled. The winter wind howled through the courtyard, swirling the dust over the fresh grave. But Olga did not shiver. She was the ice now, and the ice does not feel the cold. The messengers rode swiftly from the gates of Kiev, their horses' breath pluming like dragon smoke in the biting air. They carried the parchment sealed with the trident of the Rurikid dynasty, a symbol that now belonged solely to the woman standing atop the wooden ramparts. Olga watched them disappear into the white expanse of the steppe, her hands resting on the rough-hewn timber of the palisade. Beneath the frozen earth of the courtyard behind her lay the first silence she had imposed upon her enemies, the deep trench where 20 men, still seated in their great wooden boat, had been swallowed by the soil. The earth had accepted them, just as it accepted the fallen leaves and the winter snow, indifferent to their status or their pride. To Olga, the ground was not merely soil, it was a vault, and she had only just begun to fill it. She turned from the horizon and descended into the heart of the city. Her people watched her with a mixture of reverence and terrifying awe. They knew what lay beneath the fresh mound in the courtyard. Yet their princess moved with the grace of a river that had not yet frozen over. There was no mania in her eyes, no fever of vengeance that burned bright and hot. Instead, there was a cold, subterranean current, a resolve as hard and clear as diamond. She returned to her chambers, where the young Sviatoslav played with a wooden sword, unaware that his mother was currently carving the future of his realm with a blade made of words and fire. In the land of the Drevlians, amidst the dense forests that gave them their name, Prince Mal received the messengers with a triumphant grin. He sat in his great hall in Iskarostan, the walls hung with the furs of bears and the antlers of stags. When he broke the seal and heard Olga's words read aloud, his vanity blinded him to the shadow lurking between the lines. She had not refused him. She had not declared war. Instead, she had asked for honor. She had asked for an escort worthy of a queen. To the Drevlian prince, this was the surrender of a woman who realized she could not stand alone. He saw the logic of it, for in his world, power was physical. And without Igor, Kiev was merely a ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. He did not understand that Olga did not play by the rules of the forest. She played by the rules of the mind. And so, Mal did as she requested. He summoned the governors of his lands, the wealthy merchants who controlled the river trade, and the boyars who commanded his armies. These were the noblest men of the Drevlian tribe, the architects of their society, the very pillars upon which their strength rested. They dressed in their finest garments, tunics of imported silk beneath heavy cloaks of sable and marten. They adorned themselves with heavy gold torps and rings of silver, believing they were riding to a wedding that would unite the two great powers of the Ruses. They believed they were riding to claim a kingdom. In truth, they were riding toward a silence that had been prepared specifically for them. The journey to Kiev was brisk, the winter sun casting long pale shadows across the snow. When the delegation arrived, the city did not greet them with the somber tones of a funeral, but with the bustling energy of anticipation. The gates were thrown open. The citizens of Kiev, instructed by their regent, bowed low, though their eyes remained fixed on the ground to hide the knowing glints that might betray the game. Olga stood waiting for them, not at the trench, which had been smoothed over and hidden, but at the steps of the princely hall. She wore white, the colour of mourning in the Slavic lands, but also the colour of the ice that covered the Dnieper. The Drevlian nobles dismounted, their breath misty in the cold air. They approached her with swaggering confidence, their boots crunching on the packed snow. They bowed, but it was the bow of conquerors to a prize they had already won. Olga greeted them with a soft voice, her posture submissive, her head slightly bowed. She welcomed them as the saviors of her city, the men who would bring stability back to the land. "You have travelled far," she said, her voice like the wind through dry reeds. "The road is dusty, even in winter, and the smell of the horse and the trail clings to you. Before you come into the presence of the prince's hearth, and before we speak of the future, you must cleanse yourselves. It is the custom of my people, and I would honor you by preparing the bathhouse." The request was so natural, so steeped in the traditions of hospitality common to all the Rus, that the Drevlians found no cause for suspicion. To refuse a bath after a long journey would be an insult to the host. It was a gesture of intimacy and respect. They nodded their agreement, pleased by her solicitude. They saw a woman concerned for their comfort, a future wife preparing to serve her new lords. The bathhouse of Kiev was a large, sturdy structure built of thick pine logs, caulked with moss to hold in the heat. It stood slightly apart from the main cluster of dwellings, near the edge of the fortress where the wind could carry the smoke away. Inside, the stones had already been heated in the great oven until they glowed with a dull, malevolent red. Large wooden tubs of water stood ready, and bunches of dried birch twigs, used to beat the skin and stimulate the blood, lay upon the benches. The air inside was thick and welcoming, a stark contrast to the biting frost outside. The noblest men of the Drevlians entered the bathhouse, shedding their heavy furs, their weapons, and their gold. They stripped away the armor of their station, leaving their swords and their suspicions at the door. They entered the heat naked and vulnerable, laughing amongst themselves, congratulating one another on the ease of their victory. They poured water over the hot stones, and the steam hissed and rose in great blinding clouds, wrapping them in a fog of warmth and relaxation. Outside, the courtyard was silent. Olga stood alone, watching the wooden structure. The laughter from within was muffled by the thick logs, sounding distant and dreamlike. She raised a hand, a single sharp gesture. Her guards moved with the synchronized precision of a pack of wolves. They did not rush with battle cries. They moved with the quiet efficiency of executioners. The heavy wooden doors of the bathhouse were slammed shut. The iron latch, cold and unyielding, was dropped into place. Then they began to pile the brushwood. It was dry, seasoned timber, gathered for the deep winter, and it was stacked high against the walls, against the door, and beneath the eaves. Inside, the laughter faltered. Perhaps one of the governors tried to open the door to let in a breath of cool air, and found it immovable. Perhaps the smell of smoke began to seep through the mossy cracks, distinct from the smell of the heating oven. The confusion would have been brief, replaced quickly by a dawning, horrific realization. They pounded on the door, their fists thudding uselessly against the heavy timber. They shouted, invoking the laws of hospitality, the laws of gods and men. Olga did not answer. She accepted a torch from a nearby soldier. The flame danced in the wind, wild and hungry. She stepped forward and touched the fire to the dry brushwood. It caught instantly. The fire did not hesitate. It climbed the walls of the bathhouse with a roar that drowned out the screams from within. The pine logs, rich with resin, acted as fuel, and the structure became a singular, glowing ember against the grey sky. The heat radiated outward, forcing the guards to step back, but Olga stood her ground. She watched the flames consume the arrogance of the Drevlians. She watched the smoke rise, carrying the souls of the men who had thought to replace her husband. This was not merely an execution, it was a purification. In the old ways, fire was the cleanser. It stripped away the flesh and left only the truth of the bone. Olga was burning away the insult to her lineage. She was burning away the weakness that had invited the Drevlian revolt. As the roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks that rivaled the stars, she turned away. The second wave was broken. The governing mind of the Drevlian state, their administrators, their generals, their chiefs, was now ash. But the body of the enemy still lived. The common soldiers, the vast numbers of the Drevlian tribe in Iskorostin, remained. And for them she had a different plan. She did not rest. While the embers of the bathhouse still glowed, she summoned her scribes once more. She sent a message to Prince Mal, who sat in Iskorostin, waiting for his nobles to return with his bride. The message was brief, laden with a sorrow that felt heavy and authentic on the parchment. "Your nobles have been received with great honor," she wrote. "They are preparing for my arrival. I am coming to you now, but before I enter your house as a wife, I must perform the duty of a widow. I must go to the place where my husband was killed. I must weep over his grave and hold a funeral feast, a trizna, in his honor. Prepare the mead. Prepare the city. I come with a small retinue to say my final goodbyes to the past." It was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. She played upon the sanctity of grief. No pagan prince would deny a widow her final rites of mourning. It reinforced the illusion that she was accepting her fate, transitioning from the wife of Igor to the wife of Mal. It lulled them into a deep, sympathetic complacency. Olga left Kiev with a select group of soldiers. They were not few, but they were not an invasion force. They were her personal guard, the elite, men who had served Igor, and now served his memory with a fanaticism that Olga had carefully cultivated. They concealed their weapons beneath mourning cloaks. They rode not with banners of war, but with the sombre quiet of a funeral procession. They arrived in the Drevlian lands, at the edge of the forest near the city of Iskorostin. The location was significant. It was near the place where the birch trees had snapped, tearing Igor apart. The Drevlians came out to meet them, led by those few elders who had not gone to Kiev. They brought with them great wagons of mead, brewed from the dark honey of the forest bees, potent and sweet. Olga stood before the tumulus she had ordered to be raised. She wept. Her wails echoed off the trees, a haunting sound that chilled the Drevlian onlookers. It was a performance of such raw power that even her own soldiers were moved. She called out to Igor's spirit, promising him rest, promising him justice, though the Drevlians misunderstood the nature of that justice. "Where are our nobles?" the Drevlians asked, looking at her small retinue. "Where are the men we sent to escort you?" Olga dried her eyes, her face pale and beautiful in the winter light. "They follow behind me," she lied, her voice steady as stone. "They travel with the main baggage train of my dowry. They will be here soon. But tonight we mourn. Tonight you must drink to the memory of the great Prince Igor, for in death all enmity ceases." The Drevlians, eager to please their future queen, and relieved by the prospect of peace, sat down to the feast. The mead flowed like a river. Olga's servants moved among them, filling cups, urging them to drink deeply, to toast the fallen, to toast the Union, to toast the gods. The Rus soldiers did not drink. They touched their lips to the cups, but swallowed nothing. They waited, their eyes scanning the growing disorder of the Drevlian ranks. As the hours passed, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the fires of the encampment cast flickering shadows against the trees. The Drevlians, unaccustomed to the calculated sobriety of their guests, fell into the heavy, clumsy intoxication of the feast. Their vigilance dissolved in the honeyed wine. They sang boisterous songs boasting of their strength, boasting of how they had slain the wolf Igor. Olga sat at the head of the circle, watching. She watched as their speech slurred, as their eyelids grew heavy, as their heads began to droop onto their chests. The noise of the feast slowly died down, replaced by the rhythmic breathing of 5,000 sleeping men. The forest became quiet, save for the crackling of the logs. The moon rose, high and indifferent. Olga stood up. She smoothed the folds of her dress. She looked at the sprawling mass of the Drevlian army, lying vulnerable on the ground, defeated not by iron, but by their own thirst and hubris. She looked at her captains and gave a single silent nod. The slaughter was not a battle, it was a harvest. Her soldiers drew their swords. They moved among the sleeping forms with grim efficiency. There were no duels, no clashes of steel, no heroic last stands. There was only the wet sound of blades finding throats, the stifled gasps of men waking to their death, and then silence again. It was methodical work. Olga walked through the carnage, stepping over the bodies of the men who had killed her husband. She felt no revulsion. In her mind, this was simply the balancing of a scale. They had shed the blood of the Rurikid line. Now the earth drank their blood in return. 5,000 men died that night. The flower of the Drevlian army, the strength of their youth, was extinguished while they dreamed of victory. When the sun rose the next morning, it illuminated a field of red snow. The tryzna was complete. Igor had been mourned with a sacrifice worthy of a king. Olga did not linger. The emotional debt was paid, but the political reality remained. The city of Iskorostan still stood. Its walls were high, and its people would now be terrified and desperate. They would know, finally, who they were dealing with. The mask of the grieving widow had been dropped, revealing the visage of the avenging sovereign. She returned to Kiev not to rest, but to marshal the full might of the Kievan Ruses. She had decapitated the Drevlian leadership in the bathhouse. She had crippled their army at the funeral feast. Now she would come for the city itself. She called for her generals, her voice ringing with a terrifying authority in the great hall. "The time for tricks is over," she declared, her eyes scanning the faces of her warriors. "Now we bring the siege. Gather the levies. Sharpen the spears. We return to Iskorostan, and we do not leave until the very name of Drevlian is a whisper in the ashes." The winter was ending. The ice on the rivers was beginning to groan and crack, signaling the coming of spring. But for the Drevlians, the true winter was only just beginning. Olga mounted her horse, her son Sviatoslav by her side. He was still a child, his hand barely large enough to hold a spear, yet she brought him. He needed to see this. He needed to see that a ruler does not merely inherit a throne. They must sometimes build it from the bones of those who would tear it down. The army of Kiev marched. The sound of their boots was like thunder rolling across the plains, and in the distance, Iskorosten waited, a city of wood and fear, unaware that the final element of Olga's revenge would not come from the earth, or the water, or the sword, but from the sky itself. The birds were nesting in the eaves, and soon they would be called to serve the widow's wrath. The trench was full, the bathhouse was cold ash. The feast was ended. Now the firebirds would take flight. The earth in the courtyard of the Kievan citadel had been turned, broken and flattened again, hiding the grim secret of the 20 ambassadors beneath a layer of fresh, innocent snow. The silence that settled over the city was heavy, not with peace, but with the breathless anticipation of a storm that is yet to break. Olga stood on the wooden gallery of her palace, her breath pluming in the frigid air, looking down at the patch of ground that served as the grave for the living. She felt no remorse, only the cold, hard clarity of survival. The first debt had been paid, but the ledger of her husband's death was far from balanced. She knew that news travelled slowly through the dense, snow-choked forests of the Russes, and silence was her greatest weapon. The Drevlians, in their city of Iskorosten, believed their 20 envoys were being feted in the great halls of Kiev, negotiating the surrender of a helpless widow. Olga summoned her scribe, a man whose hands were stained with ink and trembling with the knowledge of what his mistress was capable of. She dictated a message, not of war, but of supreme deceptive humility. She sent word back to the Drevlians, to Prince Mal who sought to claim her, saying that the 20 men he had sent were not enough. If she was to leave the high seat of Kiev and come to him, if she was to bring the wealth and illegitimacy of the Rurikid dynasty to his bed, she required a greater honor. She demanded that he send his most distinguished men, the governors, the boyars, the wealthy merchants, and the elders of the clans to escort her. To come with anything less, she whispered through the ink, would be a slight to her dignity. It was a trap baited with vanity, designed to decapitate the Drevlian leadership in a single stroke, and in their arrogance, believing the widow was already theirs, they walked willingly into the snare. Weeks passed, the winter deepening, the rivers locking tight under armor of grey ice. Then the watchmen on the southern walls sounded their horns. The second delegation had arrived. They were the finest men of the forest tribes, confident and resplendent in their attire. They rode fine horses, their cloaks lined with sable and marten, gold torques gleaming at their throats, and their beards groomed and oiled. They did not look at the ground where their brothers lay buried. They looked only at the high timber walls of the citadel, seeing a prize they had already won. They believed they were coming to collect a queen. They did not know they were coming to meet a sorceress of vengeance. Olga met them in the lower courtyard. She was dressed in the severe, dark robes of mourning, her face a mask of pale porcelain. She bowed to them, a gesture that made the Drevlian nobles swell with pride. But she did not invite them immediately into the feast hall. She wrinkled her nose slightly, a delicate, almost imperceptible gesture, and gestured toward the large wooden structure that stood near the edge of the complex. It was the bathhouse. The banya, a sacred place in the Slavic world where the elements of fire, water, and stone met to purify the soul and body. You have traveled long roads, Olga said, her voice like the murmur of a calm river. The dust of the journey clings to you. It is not fitting for the highest lords of the Drevlians to appear before the people of Kiev weary and unwashed. Go, cleanse yourselves. The stones are hot, the steam is rising. Wash, and then come to me. Then we shall feast. It was a command wrapped in the silk of hospitality. to refuse the bath would have been a grave insult to the hostess and a violation of the ancient laws of guest right. The Drevlian lords, eager to wash away the grime of the saddle and prepare themselves for the celebration, nodded their agreement. They dismounted, handing their weapons to Olga's guards, another custom, for no steel could enter the sacred peace of the bathhouse, and stripped off their heavy furs, their gold chains, and their fine leather boots. They entered the banya laughing, their voices booming against the pine logs. Inside, the air was thick and white. The great stone stove in the corner radiated a fierce, dry heat. They climbed onto the wooden benches, the smell of dried birch leaves and pine resin filling their lungs. They threw ladles of water onto the glowing rocks, the stones hissing and spitting as the steam exploded upward, wrapping them in a suffocating, cleansing cloud. They beat their skin with bundles of leafy twigs, relaxing into the heat, congratulating themselves on their cleverness, on how easily they had tamed the Kievan wolf. Outside, the laughter was muffled by the thick timber walls. Olga stood motionless. She watched as her loyal retainers, men who had served Igor and now served his son through her, stepped forward. They did not carry towels or oils. They carried heavy beams of oak and iron bars. Silently, efficiently, they closed the heavy wooden doors of the bathhouse. The latch fell with a heavy clank that might have been heard inside, but was likely mistaken for the settling of the wood. Then the hammering began. They drove great iron spikes into the frame, wedging the door shut, sealing the building as tight as a coffin. The men inside, confused by the noise, began to shout. They pounded on the thick door, their wet fists thudding uselessly against the timber. "Open!" they cried. "We are clean! We are ready!" Olga raised her hand. A torch was brought to her. She did not throw it herself. She merely nodded. Her soldiers piled brushwood, dry straw, and pitch-soaked logs against the base of the bathhouse. The fire took hold with a terrifying speed. The dry timber of the walls, seasoned by years of heat from within, drank the flames greedily. The smoke began to curl, first grey, then black, seeping through the chinks in the logs. The shouting inside changed pitch. It was no longer the demanding tone of lords, but the frantic, primal screaming of trapped animals. The heat inside, intended to purify, began to climb beyond endurance. The fire climbed the walls, wrapping the structure in a brilliant, roaring embrace. The roof, thatched and dry, caught with a whoosh that sounded like a heavy sigh. Olga did not turn away. She watched the flames dance against the grey winter sky. She listened to the screams until they became one single high-pitched wail, and then, eventually, until they faded into the crackling of the fire and the crashing of falling timbers. She stood there until the roof collapsed inward in a fountain of sparks, burying the finest men of the Drevlian nation in a tomb of ash and ember. When the fire finally died down to a glowing heap of coals, Olga turned to her son, Sviatoslav. He was small, barely able to understand the gravity of the politics, but he understood the fire. "This is how a ruler protects the hearth," she seemed to say with her silence. "You destroy the hand that reaches for the throat." But the work was not done. 2 debts were paid, but the Drevlians in Iskorostan still did not know. They waited for news, unaware that their entire nobility had been erased from the earth. Olga knew that she could not wait for the rumor of her deeds to reach them. She had to strike before the truth did. She summoned her retinue, a small army of loyal Varangian guards and Slavic warriors. She dictated one final message to the Drevlians. "I am coming to you," she wrote. "Prepare the mead in the city where my husband was killed. I wish to hold a funeral feast, a trizna, over his grave. I wish to weep for him one last time before I enter the house of your prince. Prepare everything." She left the ashes of the bathhouse behind and rode south. The journey was long and sombre. The landscape of the Ruses was a vast, unending ocean of trees, broken only by the frozen ribbon of the Dnieper River and its tributaries. The air smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. Olga rode at the head of her column, her face hidden behind a veil, not of shame, but of calculation. She carried with her a small entourage of servants, but hidden within the baggage train, beneath the supplies and the gifts, were weapon swords honed to a razor's edge, axes heavy enough to cleave a shield. When they approached the lands of the Drevlians, the people came out to meet her. They brought bread and salt, bowing low to the woman who would be their queen. They saw her small retinue and felt safe. They asked, "Where are our envoys? Where are the lords we sent to fetch you?" Olga, sitting high on her horse, looked down at them with eyes as cold as the river ice. "They are following with my baggage train," she lied, her voice steady. "They travel slowly, burdened with the wealth I bring to you." The Drevlians accepted the lie because they wanted it to be true. They led her to the great burial mound outside the city of Iskorostan. It was a high kurgan, a hill of earth piled over the remains of her husband, Igor. It was here that they had torn him apart. It was here that his blood had soaked into the soil. Olga dismounted and walked up the slope of the mound. She fell to her knees, weeping loud, theatrical tears. She wailed for Igor, her voice echoing across the fields. To the Drevlians watching, it was the sound of a grieving widow saying farewell. To her soldiers, it was a war cry disguised as a lament. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, the feast began. The Drevlians had obeyed her command. They had brewed great cauldrons of mead, sticky and sweet, fortified with herbs to make it potent. 5,000 Drevlians gathered around the mound soldiers, citizens, the garrison of the city. They came to celebrate the union of the tribes, the end of the conflict. Olga moved among them, a dark ghost in the flickering light of the bonfires. She commanded her own servants to serve the Drevlians. "Drink," she urged them softly. "Drink to the memory of my lord Igor. Drink to the future of our people." The Drevlians drank. They drank from horns and wooden bowls, tipping back the golden liquid until it ran down their beards. They toasted Olga. They toasted Prince Mal. They toasted their own strength. Olga's own men stood back, sipping only water or pretending to drink, their eyes sharp, watching the Drevlians grow loud, then clumsy, then stuporous. The night deepened. The fires burned low. The singing of the Drevlians turned into slurred mumbling. Bodies began to slump against the logs, overcome by the heavy mead and the false security of the night. 5,000 men, the strength of the city, lay scattered around the burial mound like sheaves of wheat, waiting for the thresher. Olga stood near the fire. The tears were gone from her face. The mask was dropped. She looked at the sprawling, drunken mass of her enemies. The men who had killed the father of her son, the men who had thought to buy her like cattle. She raised a white handkerchief, letting it catch the light of the dying fire. It was a small movement, a flutter of cloth in the darkness. At once the night was torn apart. Her soldiers, sober and waiting, drew their swords. There was no battle cry, no horn blast to warn the sleepers. There was only the wet, rhythmic sound of steel meeting flesh. It was not a fight, it was a harvest. The Drevlians, heavy with sleep and drink, could not lift their shields. They were cut down where they lay. Throats were open to the night air. Hearts were pierced before they could beat in fear. Olga walked through the carnage, her hem trailing in the darkening mud. She did not strike a blow herself. She was the architect, not the bricklayer. She watched as the blood of 5,000 men soaked into the earth of the burial mound, seeping down to where Igor's spirit waited. It was a trizna, indeed a funeral feast, where the guests became the sacrifice. For hours the grim work continued, until the only sound remaining was the heavy breathing of her soldiers and the crackle of the embers. The field was silent. The Drevlian army was no more, but as dawn broke, casting a pale, indifferent light over the field of slaughter, Olga looked up. Across the plain, the wooden walls of Iskorostan still stood. The city itself was locked tight. The people inside, those who had not come to the feast, had heard the screams in the night. They knew now. The deception was over. The veil was lifted. Olga wiped a speck of blood from her sleeve. She had buried their ambassadors. She had burned their nobles. She had slaughtered their army. But the heart of the enemy, the city itself, still beat. She turned to her generals, her face hard as granite. "They will not open the gates now," she said quietly. "We must make them wish they had." She ordered the siege lines to be dug. The winter was ending, and the ground was softening, but the walls of Iskorostan were high and strong. She knew that swords alone would not take the city. She needed something else. She needed a way to bring the fire inside the walls, to bypass the wood and the stone. She looked up at the sky, where the birds, pigeons, and sparrows were wheeling in the morning light, returning from the fields to their nests in the eaves of the city houses. They flew freely over the walls, ignoring the boundaries of men. Olga watched them, her eyes narrowing. A thought, dark and brilliant, began to form in the crucible of her mind. The earth and the water had served her. Now she would turn to the air. The siege of Iskorostan had stretched through the turning of the seasons, a long and stubborn stalemate that weighed heavily on the earth. For a full year, Olga's army had encircled the Drevlian capital, their campfires forming a ring of stars that mirrored the constellations above. Yet the wooden walls of the city remained barred. The Drevlians, trapped within, knew that surrender meant death, for they had seen what became of their ambassadors, buried in the earth and burned in the bathhouse. And so they fought with the desperate courage of those who have no tomorrow, holding the line against the woman who had become their doom. But swords and spears were not the only weapons in the arsenal of the regent of Kiev. As she watched the pigeons and sparrows drifting over the battlements, ignoring the shouting men and the thud of arrows, the plan that had sparked in her mind began to cool into a hard, diamond-like resolve. She understood now that to break the city, she did not need to batter down the gates. She simply needed to be invited in. She sent a messenger to the walls, a man with a voice that carried over the wind, bearing words not of war, but of unexpected mercy. He called out to the starving defenders, asking them why they persisted in their folly. All other Drevlian towns had already submitted, he shouted. They were already paying tribute, tilling their fields in peace, and sleeping soundly in their beds. Why did Iskorostan alone choose to die of hunger? The elders of the city, gaunt and weary, called back from the ramparts. They would gladly pay tribute, they cried, but they feared her revenge for the death of her husband. They feared the price she would ask would be blood. Olga's response was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. She told them that her revenge was already complete. The ambassadors were dead. The nobles were gone. The initial slaughter had satisfied her grief. Now she was no longer the grieving widow, but the pragmatic ruler. She required only a symbolic submission to lift the siege and return home. "I do not ask for honey or furs or wax," her message ran, deceptively simple. "You are impoverished by the war. I ask only for a small gift, a token of your obedience. Give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house." Relief washed over the city of Iskorostan like a summer rain. The demand was so small, so childishly simple, that it disarmed them completely. They believed the fierce princess had tired of the war, that she merely wanted to save face before withdrawing. Eagerly, the people of the city scoured their eaves and lofts. They caught the birds that nested in their roofs, the gentle cooing pigeons and the flitting sparrows, and gathered them into crates with light hearts. They sent the tribute out through the gates, bowing low, believing they had bought their lives with feathers. Olga received the birds with a cold, impassive grace. She distributed them among her soldiers, instructing them to treat the creatures gently until the sun began to dip below the horizon. As the twilight deepened, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and charcoal, she issued her final command. Her warriors took small pieces of cloth, soaked in sulphur and bound with long, light threads. They tied these deadly burdens to the legs of the birds. Then, at a signal that ran silently through the ranks, they lit the sulphur and released the captives. It was a sight of terrible, mesmerizing beauty. Thousands of birds, frightened by the flames trailing beneath them, did what instinct commanded. They flew home. They rose in a great chaotic cloud, a swarm of living meteors ascending against the darkening sky. To the Drevlians watching from the walls, it must have looked as if the stars themselves were falling upward, or as if a legion of fire spirits was rushing to embrace them. The birds descended upon the city. They sought their nests under the eaves of the wooden houses, in the thatch of the barns, in the dry lofts filled with hay. Simultaneously, in thousands of hidden corners across Iskorostan, the fire took hold. The city did not burn building by building. It ignited all at once. A collective gasp of flame roared into the night, turning the wooden fortress into a cauldron of heat and light. The sky turned a violent orange, illuminating the terrified faces of the inhabitants who rushed from their burning homes, only to find the streets choked with smoke. There was no water enough to drown such a fire, for it came from the air, from the very sanctuaries of their homes. As the gates opened and the people fled the inferno, they ran straight into the waiting steel of Olga's army. The vengeance was absolute. The elders who had negotiated the peace were captured. Some were given to the soldiers as slaves, others were left to perish. The city of Iskorostan, the place that had dared to break the spine of a Rurikid prince, was erased from the earth, leaving only a scar of ash and silence. But as the smoke cleared and the screams faded into history, a transformation began within Olga herself. She stood amidst the ruins, the smell of charred timber heavy in the air, and realized that destruction, while satisfying, was a finite resource. She had burned the rebellion out of the land, but a ruler cannot govern a graveyard. The fire had served its purpose. Now she needed to build something that could withstand the passage of time. The era of the avenging widow ended there, in the ashes of Iskorostan, and the era of the architect began. Olga understood that the revolt had stemmed from chaos, the old way of gathering tribute, the polyu, where the prince rode out each winter to plunder what he could, was arbitrary and cruel. It bred resentment. It was the method of a raider, not a queen. If Kievan Rus was to survive, it had to become a state, bound by law rather than fear alone. She began to travel through her vast, wild lands, but this time she did not bring fire. She brought order. She moved north to Novgorod, and down along the great rivers, the arteries of her realm. Where her husband had seen only opportunities for plunder, she saw the need for structure. She established the Parkosti. These were administrative centres, trading posts fortified and staffed by her own officials. No longer would the prince have to ride through hostile forests to demand payment at sword point. Instead, the tribute would be brought to the Pogosti, to neutral ground under the watchful eye of the crown's agents. She instituted uroki, the first written tax laws in the history of the East Slavic people. These laws set fixed, predictable amounts for tribute. The tribes knew exactly what they owed, and they knew that once it was paid, they were safe. It was a revolution of the mind. She replaced the unpredictable terror of the raid with the dull, reassuring certainty of the tax. She marked the land itself. She established hunting grounds and defined boundaries, placing stone markers and nets to show where the prince's domain began and ended. She was weaving the loose collection of tribes into a single tapestry, stitching them together with the thread of administration. The people watched her pass, not with the terror they had felt for the Vikings of old, but with a new kind of awe. She was the wise one, the woman who brought the law to the wilderness. Years flowed by like the waters of the Dnieper. The boy prince, Sviatoslav, grew into a man. He was his father's son, a creature of war who despised the comforts of the palace. He slept in the open fields with a saddle for a pillow, ate horseflesh roasted over open fires, and moved with the restless energy of a predator. Olga loved him with a fierce protective intensity, but she saw the widening gulf between them. He looked to the steppe, to the sword and the horizon. She looked to the soul of the realm. Her gaze turned southward, to the shimmering golden dream that lay across the Black Sea. Constantinople. the Miklagard of the Norse sagas. The city of the world's desire. Olga knew that true power lay not just in grain and wax, but in legitimacy. Kievan Rus was still seen by the ancient empires as a land of barbarians, a forest kingdom of fur-clad pagans. To elevate her people, she had to engage with the center of the civilized world, and so, around the year 957, she prepared for the greatest journey of her life. It was not a raid, it was a procession. A grand fleet of monoxylar ships hewn from single massive tree trunks assembled on the river. She brought with her a retinue of hundreds, kinsmen, merchants, translators, and servants. They navigated the deadly rapids of the Dnieper, where the water foamed over jagged rocks and Pecheneg raiders waited in the tall grass and finally burst out into the open, endless blue of the Black Sea. When the great chain that guarded the Golden Horn was lowered to admit them, Olga stood at the prow of her ship, her eyes drinking in the sight of Constantinople. It was a city of stone and marble in a world of wood. The great domes of the churches floated above the city like golden clouds. The aqueducts spanned the valleys like the bones of giants. The air smelled of spices, incense, and the salt of two seas. It was overwhelming, designed to make visitors feel small. But Olga did not shrink. She stood tall, a daughter of the north, ready to meet the heir of Rome. She was received by the Emperor Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, born in the purple. The imperial court was a theatre of intimidation. As she approached the throne, mechanical lions made of gold roared and lashed their tails. Golden birds sang in the artificial trees. The throne itself rose into the air, lifting the emperor high above his guests. It was a display of technology and wealth meant to crush the spirit of any barbarian envoy. But Olga was not easily crushed. She observed the pageantry with a calm, analytical gaze. She saw the power of the spectacle, the way religion and statecraft were fused into a single, blinding light. She realized that the Christian god of the Greeks was not just a spiritual figure, but a pillar of imperial authority. To bring this faith to Kiev would be to bring the majesty of Rome to the Dnieper. The conversations between the emperor and the regent were a delicate dance of diplomacy. The chronicles say that Constantine was struck by her beauty and her sharp, clear intellect, despite her age. He saw in her a potential ally, perhaps even a way to bring the dangerous Ruses under the yoke of Byzantium through marriage. He proposed to her, offering to unite their dynasties. Olga, ever the strategist, did not refuse him outright. Instead, she bowed her head and spoke of her soul. She was a pagan, she reminded him. How could the Christian emperor marry a woman who worshipped the thunder and the spirits of the river? She must be baptized first. And, to honor her rank, she insisted that the emperor himself must be her godfather, lifting her from the baptismal font. Constantine agreed, seeing this as a victory. The Patriarch of Constantinople performed the rite in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, under the vast, mosaic-covered dome that seemed to contain the heavens themselves. The air was thick with frankincense and the chanting of choirs that sounded like angels. The water was poured, the oil anointed, and Olga cast aside her pagan past. She took the name Helen, after the mother of Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor. She rose from the waters not just as a Christian, but as a spiritual equal to the sovereigns of Europe. When the ceremony was done and the feasting began, the emperor renewed his proposal. Now that she was a Christian, there was no barrier. He asked for her hand. Olga smiled, a smile that was both gracious and cutting. "How can you marry me?" she asked softly, her voice echoing in the marble hall. "When you have just baptized me and called me your daughter? By the laws of your own church, a godfather cannot marry his goddaughter. It would be incest." The emperor paused, the realization dawning on him. He had been outmaneuvered. The barbarian queen had used his own laws, his own faith, and his own ritual to place herself beyond his reach, while still extracting the spiritual legitimacy she sought. He looked at her, not with anger but with a sudden, grudging respect. "Olga," he said. "You have outwitted me." She remained in Constantinople for some time, absorbing the culture, the liturgy, and the mechanisms of imperial rule. She walked the colonnaded streets, visited the libraries, and prayed in the sanctuaries. She was gathering the seeds of a new civilization to carry back to the dark earth of the north. She saw a future for her people that rose above the cycle of blood feuds and harvest raids, a future written in books and sung in stone cathedrals. But when she prepared to leave, the tension of her dual existence resurfaced. The emperor, trying to salvage some authority, demanded tribute and soldiers from her, treating her as a vassal. Olga, standing on the deck of her ship as the sails caught the wind, sent back a message that was pure defiance. "If you will come to Kiev and stand in my court as long as I have stood in yours," she said, "then I will give you what you ask." She sailed north, back up the great rivers, carrying icons, vestments, and priests. She carried the cross of the new faith, her heart full of hope that she could transform her son as she had transformed herself. She arrived in Kiev, the golden domes of Constantinople still burning in her memory, only to find the wooden walls of her city stark and grey. Sviatoslav was waiting. He was a man fully grown now, a warrior with a shaven head and the long single lock of hair that marked his nobility. He wore an earring of gold and ruby, and his clothes were clean but simple, indistinguishable from those of his best soldiers. Olga went to him, showing him the cross, speaking of the one true God, of the beauty of the liturgy, of the peace that faith could bring to a ruler's heart. She urged him to accept baptism, to lead his people into this new light. Sviatoslav laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, but it was hard, like iron striking flint. He looked at his mother with a mixture of pity and stubbornness. "How can I accept this foreign law?" he asked. "My Druzina, my warriors, would mock me. They would say I have become a Greek woman. My power comes from their respect, and they respect strength, not incense." He turned away from her, towards the training grounds where men were sharpening swords and preparing for the next campaign. He had no interest in the sophisticated diplomacy of the South or the moral constraints of the new religion. He wanted to expand the borders of Ruses with the edge of an axe. He wanted to destroy the Khazars, to challenge the Bulgars, to carve a name for himself that would make the world tremble. Olga realized then that the bridge she had built would not be crossed in her lifetime. She had planted the seed, but the winter of her son's heart was too deep for it to bloom. She would not force him. She knew the futility of forcing a river to flow uphill. Instead, she retreated into the role of the silent guardian, while Sviatoslav rode out to war, disappearing into the dust and distance of the steppe for months and years at a time. Olga remained in Kiev. She governed the land he ignored. She raised his sons, her grandsons, telling them stories, not of Odin and Thor, but of the wisdom of Solomon and the mercy of Christ. She planted the ideas in the fertile soil of the next generation, waiting for the season to turn. She became the grandmother of the state, the quiet watcher who kept the hearth fires burning, while the storms of war raged around the borders. But the storms were drawing closer. The years of peace she had carefully constructed were fragile, and the enemies of Ruses were watching the horizon, while the warrior king was far away, dreaming of conquests in the Balkans. The shadows began to lengthen over Kiev. The pechenegs, the wolves of the steppe, had smelled the absence of the lion. They were gathering in the tall grass, their horses restless, their eyes fixed on the undefended city. The test of Olga's strength was not yet over. Indeed, her final battle would be fought not for vengeance nor for law, but for the very survival of her bloodline. The wind from the steppe carried the scent of dry grass and horse sweat long before the riders themselves appeared on the ridge. It was the summer of the year 968, and the heat lay heavy over the hills of Kiev, shimmering in waves that distorted the horizon. Olga stood upon the ramparts of the city she had built into a fortress of law and stone, shielding her eyes against the glare. She was older now, The golden braids of her youth had turned to the colour of iron and snow, and the smooth skin that had once beguiled an emperor was etched with the map of 1,000 hard decisions. But her back was as straight as a birch tree, and her hands, resting on the wooden parapet, were steady. She watched the dark line on the horizon thicken and spill over the hills like oil, the Pechenegs. They were the wolves of the vast open plains, nomadic raiders who moved with the speed of a storm and struck with the brutality of a hammer. They had sensed the emptiness of the throne. They knew that Sviatoslav, the leopard of the north, was far away, chasing glory and gold in the Balkans, dreaming of a capital on the Danube, while his own house was left with the door unlatched. The alarm bells of Kiev began to toll, a mournful, rhythmic clanging that sent birds scattering from the rooftops. But there was no army to answer the call. The great Druzina, the elite guard, had marched south with the prince. Remaining behind were only the old men, the very young, and the women. And Olga. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury for those who had someone else to save them. She turned from the wall and walked calmly down into the courtyard, where the people were beginning to gather in a rising tide of fear. She ordered the gates barred. She ordered the water from the wells to be rationed. She moved among them, not as a terrified grandmother, but as the regent who had burned Iskorostan. Her presence was a cool shadow in the heat of their terror. She gathered her grandsons Yarapok, Oleg, and the youngest Vladimir and brought them into the inner citadel. These boys were the future of the Rurikid dynasty, and she would not let the lineage be severed by the blade of a nomad. The siege began not with a battle, but with a silence. The Pechenegs did not storm the walls. They simply surrounded them. They pitched their felt tents in a ring around the city, thousands of them, cutting off every road, every path, and every trickle of trade. They were numerous as the sands of the sea, their campfires at night turning the dark fields into a mirror of the starry sky. Inside the walls, the city began to suffocate. Days turned into weeks. The summer sun baked the mud bricks of the houses until they radiated heat long into the night. Water became scarce. Food stores dwindled. The crying of children and the lowing of thirsty cattle became the background music of their captivity. The Pechenegs waited, patient and cruel, knowing that thirst would do the work of 1,000 arrows. Olga knew that without help, the city would fall. On the far side of the Dnieper River, a small Rus's force under the command of a general named Pretich was encamped, but they did not know the desperation of the capital. They could not see through the ring of enemies. A message had to be sent, but to leave the city was death. It was then that a young boy stepped forward from the crowd. He was nameless in the chronicles, a youth who had perhaps grown up in the borderlands, for he possessed a skill that was now worth more than gold. He spoke the language of the Pechenegs. He stood before the elderly regent, small and slight, and offered his life for the city. Olga looked at him, seeing the trembling in his hands, but the resolve in his eyes. She nodded a silent benediction, and gave him the bridle of a horse to carry in his hand. The boy slipped out of the city gates at twilight, when the light was grey and confusing. He walked boldly into the heart of the enemy camp. He did not run, he did not hide. He walked among the Pecheneg warriors, wandering through their herds, shaking the bridle in his hand and calling out in their own rough tongue, asking if anyone had seen his runaway horse. It was a deception of breathtaking audacity. To the Pechenegs, he was just another camp follower, a boy looking for a lost beast in the chaos of the siege. He walked past their fires, past the sharpening of swords, past the sentries who barely spared him a glance. His heart must have hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his pace never quickened until he reached the banks of the river. There the charade ended. He threw off his tunic and plunged into the dark waters of the Dnieper. The splash alerted the guards. Realizing too late that they had been tricked, the Pechenegs rushed to the bank, firing arrows into the gloom. The water hissed as the shafts pierced the surface, but the boy swam with the strength of desperation, diving deep, surfacing only to gasp for air until he reached the far shore. He stumbled out of the mud, exhausted, and was brought before General Pretich. The message he delivered was stark and terrified. If you do not draw near to the city tomorrow morning, the people will surrender to the Pechenegs. The morning sun rose on a scene of calculated theatre. Pretich, knowing his force was too small to defeat the nomad army in open battle, chose the weapon of illusion. He ordered his men to board their boats and push into the stream, sounding every trumpet and horn they possessed. The noise rolled across the water, a thunderous, brassy roar that echoed off the cliffs of Kiev. Inside the city, the people heard it and wept with relief, shouting from the walls that the prince had returned. The Pechenegs, hearing the fanfare and seeing the flotilla, believed that Sviatoslav himself, the invincible warrior, had arrived with his main army. Panic, which had been the companion of the besieged, now jumped to the besiegers. The nomad prince asked for a parley. Pretich met him at the riverbank. When the Pecheneg leader asked, "Are you the prince?" Pretich smiled a dangerous diplomatic smile. "I am but the commander of his vanguard." He lied smoothly. The prince himself follows close behind with a force innumerable. The lie held. The Pechenegs, fearing the wrath of Sviatoslav, broke their camp and withdrew just enough to allow the horses to water and the city to breathe. The siege was lifted, not by the sword, but by the wit of a boy and the shadow of a king. But when Sviatoslav finally did return, riding hard from the Danube with dust in his beard and the smell of foreign battles on his cloak, he did not find a mother grateful simply for survival. He found a ruler whose patience had finally run its course. The reunion between the mother and the son was a clash of two worlds. Sviatoslav was the embodiment of the old ways, wild, restless, a pagan king who slept on his saddlecloth and ate horse flesh roasted over open fires. He was a hero to his men, a force of nature who wished to move the capital of Rusas to Pereaslavets on the Danube, claiming it was the center of the world, rich with gold, silks, wine, and fruit. He saw Kiev not as a home, but as a dull outpost, far from the glory of the south. Olga, frail in body but formidable in spirit, sat in her chair and listened to his dreams of foreign empires, and them with the quiet authority of the woman who had held the state together while he played at war. She rebuked him. "You seek strange lands and care for them," she said, her voice raspy but cutting, "but you have forsaken your own people. You leave your mother and your children to the wolves while you chase the sun." It was a profound indictment. It was the friction between the conqueror and the administrator, the nomad and the builder. Sviatoslav looked at the woman who had given him life and preserved his throne, and for a moment the great warrior was a chastised child. He stayed, but his heart remained in the south. Yet the final battle Olga fought was not with her son, but with mortality. Her health began to fail rapidly after the siege. The iron will that had sustained her through the Drevlian uprising, the baptism in Constantinople, and the defense of Kiev could no longer command her own body. She lay in her chambers, the stone walls draped in tapestries, the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles and incense. This room was a sanctuary of the new faith she had brought to this pagan land. Icons of the Virgin and the Saint looked down upon her, their gold leaf glinting in the flickering light. Sviatoslav sat by her side, his large calloused hand holding her fragile one. Despite their differences, despite his refusal to accept her God, he loved her with a fierce, primal devotion. She was the only authority he had ever respected. She knew the end was near. In the old tradition, a ruler of her stature would be sent to the afterlife with a trizna, a massive, raucous funeral feast, where warriors would drink and boast, where horses and slaves might be sacrificed, where a great mound of earth would be raised to mark her passage. Sviatoslav would have wanted to give her this, to honor her as a chieftain of the Varangians, but Olga, with her last breaths, forbade it. She sowed the final stone of her legacy in the soil of her death. "I wish for no feast," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "I wish for no mound. Let my priest, Gregory, bury me according to the Christian rite. Let there be no shedding of blood, no drunken shouts, only prayer." It was her final act of rebellion against the old world, and her final lesson to the new. She was drawing a line in the sand, separating the past of Rusas from its future. She died in the year 969. The chronicles say that her son wept for her, and her grandsons wept, and all the people of Kiev wept with a great lamentation. They carried her out not to a pyre, but to a quiet grave. There was no smoke rising to the gods of thunder and wind. There was only the sound of a priest chanting in Greek and Slavonic, the smell of earth, and the silence of a city that had lost its mother. Sviatoslav buried her as she asked, confused perhaps by the humility of it, but bound by his honor to obey her. He did not understand that in this quiet burial she had won the ultimate victory. She had planted the seed of Christianity deep in the heart of the royal family, in a place where he could not dig it out. The focus of her planting had been the grandsons who stood by the grave watching. Yaropolk, Oleg, and Vladimir. Especially Vladimir, the boy who had sat at her feet while she told stories of the Byzantine court, of the great dome of the Hagia Sophia, of a god who offered redemption rather than fate. Vladimir watched the earth cover the grandmother who had been the shield of his childhood. He saw the dignity of her passing. He saw that she did not fear the dark, for she believed in a light beyond it. Sviatoslav would soon ride away again, back to his wars, back to the Danube where death awaited him at the hands of the Pechenegs, who would turn his skull into a drinking cup. He would leave the stage of history as a tragic, restless ghost. But the seed Olga had sown in the stone of Kiev remained. It lay dormant in the dark earth of the political landscape, watered by the memory of her wisdom and her strength. It would take time to germinate. There would be fratricide, civil war, and chaos in the years to follow. The brothers would turn on each other, and the soil of Rusas would drink the blood of Rurik's line. But the memory of the matriarch, the saint, the regent who held the walls against the wolves, would not fade. Vladimir would grow into a man of immense appetites and immense power, a pagan prince who mirrored his father in many ways. But when the time came for him to choose a path for his emerging empire, when he looked for a force that could unify the scattered tribes and bring Rusas into the circle of civilized nations, he would remember the quiet dignity of Olga. He would remember that she, the wisest of all rulers, had chosen the cross. Her death was not an end, but an incubation. The winter of paganism was harsh and lingering, but beneath the frost the roots were taking hold. The sowing was finished. Now, history waited for the harvest. The years rolled on, turning the pages of the chronicle. The stone walls of Kiev stood silent witness to the passing of the seasons. The dust of Sviatoslav's campaign settled, and in the heart of the city the legend of Olga began to transform. She ceased to be merely a historical figure and began to become something more: a patron, an intercessor, a bridge. As the fires of the old gods burned down to embers, the light she had kindled began to glow brighter. It was a slow dawn, creeping over the hills of the Dnieper, touching the golden domes that were yet to be built, illuminating the path for the grandson who would one day finish what she had begun. The grandmother of the state had closed her eyes, but in the darkness of the tomb, the true life of holy Rusas was just beginning to stir. The winds of the steppes had cooled the embers of Iskorosten, and the blood spilled in the Drevlian forests had long since soaked into the earth, feeding the roots of birch and pine. The regent of Russes, having forged order from chaos with a hand of iron, now turned her gaze toward a different kind of fire, not the consuming flames of revenge, but the illuminating light of the south. The Grand Princess Olga, whose name was whispered with fear in the wooden halls of the Slavic tribes, understood that power required more than swords and tax collectors. It required legitimacy. It required the weight of the ages. And so the river called to her. The Dnieper, that great winding artery of the world, did not merely flow. It beckoned. It was the road of the Varangians, the path of the Greeks, the liquid spine connecting the cold grey timber of the north to the blinding gold of the Mediterranean. It was time for the regent to travel. She did not go as a conqueror, for the walls of the southern empire were too thick for battering rams, but she did not go as a beggar either. She went as an enigma. In the year 957, the flotilla assembled. It was a grand procession of monoxalas single-trunk boats, carved from massive trees, reinforced with ribs of oak, their hulls darkened with pitch. They sat low in the water, heavy with furs, wax, honey, and slaves, the currency of the north, but heavier still with the ambition of the woman who sat at the helm. Olga left her son, the warrior prince Sviatoslav, to guard the hearth of Kiev. He was a man of the sword, a creature of the old gods, content with the thunder of hooves and the clash of iron, but his mother sought a weapon he could not grasp. She sought the mind of the world. The journey was a slow unravelling of the known universe. Southward they rode, the rhythm of the oars beating like a second heart. They passed the great rapids, where the river boiled and roared over jagged stones, demanding tribute and sweat. Here the Rus had to disembark, dragging their heavy boats over the land, vulnerable to the arrows of the Pecheneg nomads who haunted the tall grass like wolves. Olga walked these portages with her head high, her eyes scanning the horizon, her presence alone enough to steel the nerves of her retinue. She was no longer the young wife who had crossed a ferry in Pskov. She was the matriarch of a dynasty, and the wild lands seemed to recoil before her calm, icy gaze. As the river widened, shedding the constraints of the banks, the air changed. The sharp bite of the northern frost gave way to a warm saline breeze. The sky lifted, turning from a pale, wintry slate to a deep, resonant azure. And then the Black Sea opened its arms. To the Russes, this was the Pontus Euxinus, the hospitable sea, though it was vast and terrifying in its emptiness. The fleet hoisted their square sails, catching the southern winds, gliding over the dark, undulating glass of the deep water. Days turned into weeks, suspended in the blue void, until the horizon birthed a shape that defied the imagination of the forest dwellers. It began as a shimmer, a haze of white and gold rising from the water, separating itself from the mist. Slowly, the mirage solidified into stone. The walls of Constantinople, the queen of cities, Tsargrad. To enter the Golden Horn was to drift into a dream of marble. The inlet, shaped like the horn of a stag, was calm and shielded, a mirror reflecting the glories of the Roman Empire. Olga sat at the prow of her ship, her face impassive, though her mind must have been racing. She saw the immense Theodosian walls, a triple layer of limestone and brick that had broken the tides of armies for centuries. She saw the domes of 100 churches glistening like pearls in the sun, and above them all, the great dome of the Hagia Sophia, the holy wisdom, seemingly suspended from the heavens by a golden chain. The contrast was visceral. Kiev was a city of wood and earth, smelling of smoke and pine resin. Constantinople was a city of stone and porphyry, smelling of spices, salt, and ancient dust. The noise was a physical weight, the clamour of merchants from every corner of the earth, the chiming of bells, the chanting of priests, the babel of a dozen languages. Yet, as her boat sliced through the crowded waters of the harbour, Olga did not shrink. She adjusted her cloak, touched the silver clasp at her shoulder, and prepared to step onto the stone quay, not as a barbarian, but as a sovereign. The reception was a game of theatre and patience. The Byzantines, masters of bureaucracy and ceremony, made the Archantissa of Rosier wait. They kept her ships in the harbour, a subtle reminder of who held the keys to the world. But when the summons finally came, it was a spectacle designed to crush the spirit with awe. She was led through the streets, past the hippodrome where the mobs cheered for chariot races, and into the precincts of the great palace. The halls were lined with mosaics of such intricacy that they seemed to breathe saints and emperors staring down with eyes of glass and stone. The floors were polished marble, cooling the feet, swirling with veins of green and purple. In the Magnora, the great reception hall, Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus awaited. He was born in the purple, a scholar emperor, a man who wrote books on the administration of the empire and the handling of foreign nations. He viewed the Rus as dangerous but useful tools, raw energy to be harnessed or deflected. He intended to dazzle this northern widow, to show her that her power was nothing compared to the machinery of Rome. Olga approached the throne. It was the throne of Solomon, a marvel of engineering and artifice. As she drew near, the golden lions that flanked the seat suddenly roared, their mechanical jaws opening, their metal tails lashing the floor. Birds of gold, perched on a gilded tree beside the throne, began to sing, their wings fluttering with clockwork precision. It was a terrifying display of magic to the uninitiated, a demonstration that the emperor commanded not just men, but nature itself. As Olga prostrated herself a necessary diplomatic concession, the throne began to rise. It lifted high into the air, distancing the emperor from the floor, elevating him to the status of a semi-divine being. When she rose and looked up, he was gazing down from the ceiling, robed in stiff, heavy silk encrusted with gems that caught the candlelight. But the chronicles whisper that Olga was not cowed by the mechanical lions or the levitating chair. She watched the spectacle with the sharp, appraising eyes of a woman who had burned a city with birds. She saw the wires. She understood the leverage. The emperor, peering down at this woman of the north, saw something unexpected. He saw beauty, yes, she was in her prime, possessing a radiant, cold dignity. But he also saw a formidable intellect. The primary chronicle tells us that Constantine was so taken by her that he conversed with her not as a savage, but as a peer. In the days that followed, the diplomatic dance began. Constantine, perhaps in jest, or perhaps in a maneuver to absorb Ruses into the empire through marriage, remarked on her worthiness to reign with him. "You are fit to reign in this city with us," he is said to have spoken. It was a trap. To marry the emperor was to submit her land to his. Olga's response was a masterstroke of evasion and piety. "I am a pagan," she replied, her voice steady amidst the echoing marble. "If you wish to baptize me, you yourself must perform it. Otherwise, I shall not accept it." It was a request that flattered his vanity as the defender of the faith, yet it laid the groundwork for her independence. By asking him to be her godfather, she was weaving a spiritual knot that would protect her autonomy. The emperor agreed. The preparations were made. The baptism of Olga was the pivot upon which the history of Eastern Europe turned. It took place in the vast echoing cavern of the Hagia Sophia. The air inside was thick with the scent of frankincense, curling in blue ribbons toward the dome where the seraphim covered their faces with 6 wings. The light filtered through 40 windows at the base of the dome, creating a ring of fire that made the roof appear to float. Olga stepped into the baptismal font. The water was warm, blessed by the patriarch, shimmering with oil. As she descended, the heavy furs and linens of the Varangian widow were set aside. She was submerged, the water closing over her head, washing away the soot of Iskarostan, the dust of the steppes, and the old name of Helga. She rose from the water, gasping for the breath of a new life. She was anointed with myrrh, the fragrant oil sealing her forehead, her eyes, her lips, her hands. She was clothed in white, the garment of purity. She took the name Helena, the name of the first Christian empress, the mother of Constantine the Great. It was a name of power, a name that linked her directly to the history of the city she stood in. When the rituals were done and the feasts began, the emperor, now her godfather, sought to close his trap. He renewed his suggestion of marriage, or perhaps a heavy alliance that resembled it. "I wish to take thee to wife," he said, assuming the baptism had removed the final barrier. Olga, now Helena, smiled. It was the smile of a grandmaster who had seen the checkmate 10 moves ahead. "How can you take me to wife?" she asked softly. "When you yourself baptized me and called me your daughter. For among Christians, as you yourself know, this is forbidden. The law of the church was clear. A spiritual father could not marry his spiritual daughter. It was incest in the eyes of the canon. Constantine had been outwitted. He had given her the legitimacy of the faith, the prestige of the imperial name, and the protection of the church, yet he had barred himself from claiming her or her lands. Olga, the emperor laughed, conceding defeat with a rueful shake of his head. You have outwitted me. She left Constantinople not as a vassal, but as a spiritual daughter of the empire. Equal in dignity, if not in power, she carried with her gifts of gold, silver, silks, and vessels, but these were trivial compared to the invisible cargo she bore. She carried the seed of a new civilization. The return journey up the Dnieper was a voyage against the current, both literally and metaphorically. She was rowing back into the darkness, back to a land that still worshipped Perun the Thunderer and Veles the god of cattle. She was returning to a son, Sviatoslav, who would mock her new faith. My retinue would laugh at me, Sviatoslav would later sneer when she urged him to accept the cross. He was a man of the war band, and the humility of the Christian god held no appeal for a king who slept on a saddlecloth and ate horseflesh roasted over open fires. To him, the water of baptism was a sign of weakness. But Olga did not press him with the sword. She possessed the patience of the earth itself. She understood that the harvest does not come immediately after the sowing. She had established the legal structures of the state with her tax reforms. Now she had established its spiritual direction, even if the fruit would not ripen in her lifetime. The seed had been planted deep in the black soil of Russes. Yet her diplomatic genius had one more card to play, a move that demonstrated she was beholden to no single empire. Upon her return, feeling the condescension of Byzantium, who treated her as a baptized barbarian rather than a true equal, she turned her gaze west. In the year 929, envoys from Kiev arrived at the court of Otto the Thies, the King of Germany and future Holy Roman Emperor. They carried a request from Queen Helena for a bishop and priests to be sent to Kiev. It was a stunning maneuver. By inviting the Latin Church of the West, she was threatening Byzantium with a spiritual schism. She was signaling to Constantinople that if they did not treat Ruses with respect, she would take her vast realm into the fold of Rome. It was a bluff, perhaps, or a contingency plan, but it showed the world that the widow of Igor was a player on the continental stage. She triangulated between the two great powers of Christendom, the East and the West, carving out a space where Ruses could stand alone. The Latin mission, led by a monk named Adalbert, eventually failed, driven out by the pagan hostility of Sviatoslav and the people. But the point had been made. Olga had drawn the map of the future. She had shown that Kiev was not merely a trading post on the edge of the world, but a sovereign state capable of choosing its own god and its own allies. As the years of her life began to wane, the Golden Horn remained a vivid memory, a dream of light that she carried in the secret chambers of her heart. She retreated from the immediate governance of the realm, allowing Sviatoslav his wars and his conquests. He expanded the borders, smashing the Khazars, fighting the Bulgarians, stretching the dominion of Kiev to the Volga and the Danube. He was the arm of the state, muscular and bloody, but Olga was its soul. She spent her final years in Kiev, a silent guardian of the new faith. She built the first wooden churches, small islands of sanctity in a sea of paganism. She taught her grandchildren Yarapok, Oleg, and the young Vladimir stories, not of Thor and Odin, but of the carpenter from Nazareth and the great stone city where angels sang in the dome. She did not force them. She simply whispered the stories into the dark, letting them settle like dust, waiting for the wind of history to stir them. The woman who had buried men alive, who had burned a city with firebirds, now spent her nights in prayer. The duality of her existence, the ruthless regent and the saintly matriarch, was not a contradiction, but a progression. She had done what was necessary to survive the winter of anarchy, so that her people could see the spring of civilization. In the year 968, the Pechenegs besieged Kiev, while Sviatoslav was away on campaign. The nomads surrounded the city, the campfires ringing the walls like the eyes of hungry beasts. Olga, now elderly and frail, did not flee. She stood within the walls, sheltering her grandchildren, holding the city together with the sheer force of her will until the relief forces arrived. It was her final act of defense, her last stand as the shield of her people. When the end finally came, in 969, she broke the final taboo. She refused the trisna, the pagan funeral feast involving ritual slaughter and mounds of earth. She commanded that she be buried with the rites of a Christian, a priest chanting the liturgy over her grave, the smell of incense replacing the smell of blood. Her son Sviatoslav wept, the chronicles say. The man of iron, who had never shown fear in battle, was undone by the loss of the woman who had been the sky and the earth of his world. He buried her as she wished, in the ground, without a burial mound, planting her like the final seed of her own legacy. The earth accepted her. The Dnieper flowed on, indifferent to the passing of queens. But in the silence of the tomb, something had shifted irrevocably. The Golden Horn had not just been a destination, it had been a reflection. Olga had looked into the mirror of the world and seen what her people could become. She died believing she had failed to convert her son, failed to turn her land to the light. She did not know that the boy she had protected during the siege, her grandson Vladimir, had been listening. She did not know that the stories of the Great Dome and the singing angels had taken root in his young mind. She did not know that the blood she had spared and the water she had sought would one day merge. The grandmother slept, but the dream was awake. The candle she had lit in the darkness of the north flickered, low and fragile, but it did not go out. It waited for the breath of the next generation to fan it into a blaze that would consume the idols and cover the land in gold. The winter was over. The thaw had begun, and deep in the heart of the soil, the harvest was preparing to burst forth. But the spring that followed was not merely a melting of snow. It was a reshaping of the earth itself. When Olga returned to the high banks of the Dnieper, leaving the golden domes of Constantinople behind her, she did not return as the same woman who had left. She brought with her the memory of incense and the weight of a new god, but she also brought something harder, something colder and more durable than the timber walls of Kiev. She brought the concept of law. For years, the gathering of tribute had been a chaotic, bloody ritual, a seasonal raid where the prince would ride out into the dark forests and take what he could until the patience of the tribes snapped like a dry branch. Olga had seen the cost of that chaos in the bent birch trees that had torn her husband apart. She had washed that chaos away with the blood of the Drevlians, but she knew that blood alone could not build a kingdom. Revenge was a fire that burned itself out. A state required stone, and so the regent began to weave a new tapestry of the wild lands of Ruses. She did not sit idly in her tower. She travelled. The chronicles tell us she moved through the vast, breathing wilderness, not as a conqueror seeking plunder, but as an architect seeking foundations. She rode through the Desna and the Dnieper basins, marking the earth with the authority of the crown. Where there had been arbitrary demands, she established oracle-fixed sums, precise and predictable. No longer would a village fear the whim of a greedy commander. They knew the number, they knew the cost, and in that knowledge there was a strange new peace. She established pagosti, trading posts and administrative centres that stood like islands of order in the ocean of the forest. These were not just collection points, they were the anchors of the state. Here the prince's seal was law. Here merchants could rest without fear of the shadowed paths. She was drawing lines upon the mapeless world, defining hunting grounds, setting boundaries, turning a loose confederation of tribes into a singular, breathing organism. It was a revolution of the mind as much as the coin. She was teaching her people that power was not just the sword arm, but the written word, the measured grain, the stable border. Yet, while she ordered the realm with the cold precision of a master strategist, her heart remained a quiet battleground. She had built a state for her son, Sviatoslav, preserving his throne with a ferocity that had become legend. But as the boy grew into a man, the distance between them widened, a chasm that no bridge could span. Sviatoslav was a creature of the open steppe, a warrior carved from the old myths. He had no use for palaces or administrative reforms. He lived in the saddle, sleeping on horse blankets with his saddle for a pillow, eating strips of horse flesh roasted over open fires, sharing the hardships of his druzina. He was beloved by his men, a panther of war who moved with a speed that terrified his enemies. He was the embodiment of the very pagan strength Olga was slowly leaving behind. There were nights, quiet and heavy with the scent of pine, when Olga would sit with him, the firelight dancing between them. She would speak of the great God in Byzantium, of the peace that surpassed understanding, of the salvation of the soul. She urged him to accept the baptism, to join the family of Christian monarchs, to secure his place not just in Kiev, but in eternity. But Sviatoslav would only laugh, a sound like cracking wood. He did not mock her out of malice, but out of a warrior's pragmatic fear. "My druzina would laugh at me," he told her. "How can I worship a god of peace when my life is war? How can I bow to a cross when my men bow to the sword?" To him, Christianity was a weakness, a soft religion for the Greeks who hired others to fight their battles. He was a Viking at his core, bound by the code of glory and blood. He would respect his mother. He honored her wisdom and left the running of the state entirely in her hands, while he campaigned. But he would not share her altar. It was the great tragedy of her later years. She who could outwit emperors and burn cities could not turn the heart of the one person she loved most. She had to watch him ride away, year after year, disappearing into the dust of the Balkans, chasing glory, while she remained the watchman on the walls. She played a long game even then, when the Byzantine court grew arrogant, treating Russia's as a mere vassal. Olga turned her gaze westward. In a move of subtle geopolitical brilliance, she sent envoys to the court of Otto, the Holy Roman Emperor in the west. She asked for a bishop and priests, a signal to Constantinople that Kiev had other options, that the Ruses were not bound to the Greeks alone. It was a flicker of the iron diplomat she had always been, playing the great powers against one another to ensure the sovereignty of her land. But time, the one enemy she could not execute or outwit, was beginning to besiege her. By the year 968, Olga was an old woman. Her hair was silver, her movements slower, though her back remained as straight as a spear shaft. Sviatoslav was away on the Danube, dreaming of moving his capital south, leaving Kiev vulnerable, and it was then that the Pechenegs came. They were the wolves of the steppe, nomadic raiders who moved like the wind. They swarmed out of the vast grasslands, surrounding Kiev in a ring of shouting, galloping terror. The siege was sudden and brutal. The city was cut off. There was no way to send a message to Sviatoslav, no way to call for aid. Inside the walls, the air grew thick with heat and fear. The water supplies dwindled. The crying of children echoed in the wooden streets. And there, in the center of the panic, stood the grandmother. Olga did not hide in the citadel. She took charge of the defense, just as she had taken charge of the regency decades before. But this time, she was not fighting for her own power. She was fighting for the lives of her grandsons. Among the children huddling near her was the boy Vladimir. He watched her in those days of dust and thirst. He saw the way she prayed, not with the frantic desperation of the pagans sacrificing to Perun, but with a calm, silent intensity. He saw her unshakable resolve. Even as the Pechenegs rode beneath the walls, taunting the defenders, Olga stood firm, a pillar of ancient strength holding up the sky. She was the shield of the city, the mother of the land. The siege was eventually broken by a ruse, a brave messenger who spoke the Pecheneg tongue and swam the river to summon a relief force, fooling the nomads into thinking Sviatoslav himself had returned. But the experience left its mark. When Sviatoslav finally did return, riding his exhausted horse through the gates, Olga rebuked him. She did not yell. She merely spoke with the weight of her years. "You seek foreign lands," she told him, her voice thin but sharp. "You seek to rule others, while your own capital is nearly taken, and your own mother and children nearly slain. It was a shame he felt deeply, though the call of the south was still strong in his blood. He wanted to leave again, to return to his conquests. But Olga, sensing the approach of her final journey, asked him for one last tribute. "Bury me first," she said, "then go where you will." The end came in the year 969. The great regent, the burner of cities, the reformer of laws, the first Christian of the royal line, lay dying. But even in her dying, she staged a final revolution. In the traditions of her people, the death of a ruler was a loud, chaotic affair. It required a trizena, a massive funeral feast, where mead would flow like water, where warriors would hold games of combat, where horses and perhaps even servants would be sacrificed to serve the deceased in the afterlife. Great mounds of earth, kurgans, were raised over the dead, visible monuments to their earthly power. Olga forbade it all. With her last breaths, she issued a command that shocked the court. There was to be no feast, there was to be no slaughter, there was to be no mound raised high above the grass. She requested a priest. She requested the silence of the Christian rite. She wanted her body to be committed to the earth without the shedding of blood, without the drunken revelry of the pagan wake. It was her final silence, a rejection of the cycle of violence that had defined the beginning of her reign. She had begun with a trench of death for the Drevlians. She ended with a humble grave for herself. Sviatoslav wept. The great warrior, who feared nothing on the battlefield, was undone by the quiet passing of the woman who had been his world's foundation. He did not understand her faith, but he understood her strength, and he grieved her with a ferocity that shook the halls of Kiev. Yet, as the earth was shoveled over her, flat and unadorned, it seemed that her legacy had been buried with her. Her son remained a pagan. Her people remained worshippers of the thunder and the sun. The churches she had built were few and small, wooden islands in a sea of idols. To the casual observer, it might have looked as though the candle had indeed gone out, but the seed is not dead when it is buried. It is merely waiting. The boy Vladimir, now growing into a young man, stood by the grave. He remembered the smell of the incense in her private chapel. He remembered the story she had whispered to him of a God who loved mankind, of a city of gold where angels sang. He remembered her dignity during the siege. He saw the difference between the chaotic grief of his father and the peaceful departure of his grandmother. Olga had failed to turn the river of her time, but she had changed the composition of the water. She had planted an idea deep in the bedrock of the dynasty. She had shown that Rosses could be more than a collection of warring tribes. It could be a state, a civilization, a part of the wider world. Years would pass. Sviatoslav would fall in battle, his skull turned into a drinking cup by the Peshinei Khan, a pagan end for a pagan king. Fratricidal wars would tear the land apart again. Blood would water the soil. But through the chaos, the memory of the grandmother endured. When Vladimir eventually rose to the throne, when he felt the emptiness of the wooden idols that demanded blood but gave no peace, his mind would turn back to her. When his envoys travelled the world seeking a true faith, they would stand in the Hagia Sophia and say, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth." But before they ever left Kiev, the choice had, in a way, already been made. The chroniclers would later write that Olga was the dawn before the sun. She was the morning star that shines before the full light of day. She had walked in the darkness so that those who came after her could find the path. She had been the bridge between the savage and the saint, the iron and the gold. Her administrative reforms, the Bogosti and Aruki, remained. They became the skeleton of the Russian state, the infrastructure upon which all future Tsars would build. Her diplomatic cunning set the precedent that Rus's was a sovereign power, equal to the empires of the south and west. But her greatest victory was the silent one. In the quiet of the earth, St. Olga slept. She did not need a mound of dirt to mark her place. Her monument was the future itself. Her monument was the golden domes that would one day rise over Kiev, over Novgorod, over Moscow. Her monument was the history of a civilization that would struggle for 1,000 years to reconcile the two halves of her soul. the ruthless pragmatism of the ruler and the transcendent hope of the believer. The final silence of Olga was not an end. It was a pause, a breath held before the choir begins. The snow falls over the grave, covering the flat earth in a blanket of white, pristine and still. The Dnieper flows on, cold and dark, winding its way to the sea. The fires of the Drevlian cities are long extinguished. The screams of the battlefield have faded into the wind. All that remains is the story. A story of a girl from the ferry, a wife of the north, a widow of vengeance, a regent of law, and a saint of the dawn. The wheel of history turns, heavy and slow, but it turns on the axis she created. The night is deep, and the stars are cold above the Russian plain. But the dawn is coming. The sun will rise, and in the golden light of that future morning, the grandmother is waiting. Good night.